Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started in just a couple minutes. We'll pause a beat to let people trickle in, but we'll get started shortly. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're just waiting a couple minutes, maybe one more minute to let people trickle in before we get started. Okay, well, I think that's probably enough time and we can get started. But hi, everyone. Welcome to our event on Proptech and how it's impacting our communities. I'm Hannah Holloway. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at TechEquity Collaborative. I'm really excited to get into today's conversation and to speak with our panelists. Before we do that, I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of TechEquity, who we are and what we do for folks that might be joining us for the first time or rejoining us after a long time. At TechEquity, we focus on addressing inequities both within the tech industry and inequities that result from the tech industry, its products, and its business models. We do that in three primary ways: through education at events such as this one, through public policy. We work in partnership with community groups to develop a set of public policy priorities that advance the goals of our initiatives and our overall mission. And then lastly, through corporate practice, we provide recommendations for improved corporate practice so that companies who are committed to ending inequities inside of their ecosystems have tools and rubrics to do that work. We want to thank everyone for being here today. We really love being able to put on events like this for our community. If you love them and get something out of them, or just generally appreciate that an organization like us exists, we encourage you to become a member. It helps us do this work and it helps us keep existing. So my colleague Herman will be dropping a link in the chat to find out more about that. And then we have a couple of quick housekeeping items before we get into it. There is, of course, a chat function on today's Zoom. Please feel free to use that to engage with your peers, to have a conversation about what we're talking about here. We do have a code of conduct, and we ask that you honor that and keep this a safe space for learning by respecting your fellow attendees and their opinions. We do also have Q&A for the panel. So if you have a question that you'd like us to ask the panelists during the Q&A portion, please use the Q&A feature for that, not the chat feature. My colleague Marion will be pulling from Q&A and the questions that you all drop there for that section of the conversation. And then we also have ASL interpretation for today's event. And so if you would like to enable that feature, please click the interpretation function at the bottom of your screen, and Lindy will pop up to do interpretation for you. Okay, and without further ado, I guess I'd like to ground us in today's conversation and maybe some shared understanding. So Proptech, I think, is a buzzword these days that's becoming more and more widespread to refer to the ways that technology is increasingly being applied to real estate and property, and thus to homeownership and the rental experiences that we all have. It's certainly a broad term. It can cover things from digital property management and rental payment apps to algorithmic mortgage underwriting software. Given the breadth, it's perhaps unsurprising that venture capital has invested $56 billion into Proptech over the past 10 years. And as this sector has grown, it's promised a lot of things. It's promised to dramatically decrease the cost of producing new housing, to expand ownership opportunities, streamline the relationship between renters and landlords. Of course, its proponents are saying that Proptech can make housing better and more accessible, but Proptech also has the potential to exacerbate a lot of the inherent biases and inequities that are already existing within our housing system. So at TechEquity, as we were sort of seeing all of this come together, these things signal to us that we should really be taking a closer look and paying more attention to the emergent sector, both its products and its promises. We spent the last year doing that, and I'm really excited to discuss our work, our summary paper, and its larger implications with our panelists today. So with that, I think I'd like to make space for each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And maybe Katie, can we start with you?
Sure, happy to be here today. I'm Katie Fallon. I'm a principal policy associate in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. I work primarily on issues related to housing affordability and housing stability, including ongoing projects that focus on eviction data and the cleanliness of that data, eviction prevention, equity issues within tenant screening, and housing supply.
Great, thank you, Katie. Glad you could join us today. Ainsley, I'll pass to you.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. My name is Ainsley Harris. I'm a senior writer at Fast Company magazine. We write about business and technology, and I primarily write about sort of everything within business and technology, but I used to be a fintech and finance reporter, and that's a little bit of how I came to kind of be interested in Proptech, is sort of seeing that the trends there and seeing a little bit of what it played out in the fintech sector kind of got me interested. And we can talk about this more later, but it's part of how I kind of got very interested in some of the companies here. So, so excited to be here. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
We're excited to have you. And with that, Jyotswaroop, I'll pass to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jyotswaroop Bawa. I'm the Chief of Organizing and Campaigns at the California Reinvestment Coalition, and I focus on corporate accountability campaigns and state policy work. All of it benefits from the expertise within our member organizations.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. Jyotswaroop, I'd actually like to start with you. Your organization, California Reinvestment Coalition, I think of as one of the first and maybe, a really consistent voice in California calling attention to corporate landlords. Want to plug your REO to rental report, which was looking at this program, REO to rental, which is how we got the shift to corporate owners of housing in the first place. In the wake of the 2008 foreclosure crisis, the feds were eager to do something about the vacant and foreclosed homes, and so created this program to allow private equity investors to purchase them in bulk at auction. We know now, 10 plus years on, that hundreds of thousands of homes were flipped into single-family rentals to be managed by remote companies. And I'm curious if you can tell us what made that shift stand out to you at CRC way back in the day, and how have you seen the dynamic play out over the past decade of an increasingly corporate housing stock?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, the REO report was a survey of our member organizations. So the folks who are working on fair housing and also education among BIPOC communities and how to build their credit, be ready to become home buyers, were telling us that there are folks who are, exactly correct, right on paper, except they're not able to still come into home ownership because they can't compete with the all cash offers that investors have. And that is still happening now, even though we've made some strides in California laws since 2008. And if you're watching the bank failures that are happening recently, the crashes that happened in 2008, the banks that crashed in 2008, the 3 banks that crashed now are larger than those banks. So I just offer that as a point of information about how market consolidation has been happening in the previous decades, and it's not a good thing. Our regulation hasn't kept up with it. And the same thing is happening in the housing market, where we are now seeing more and more housing consolidate under larger and larger operations. And it's so problematic because these companies are primarily responding to their shareholders and have an interest in showing profitability at a quarter by quarter basis. So, it's sometimes we have to do a lot of education with elected officials where they tend to think, oh, large corporation, they have the resources to actually maintain properties and do right by tenants they don't actually realize that these companies just want to show quarterly profits. So they're actually worse landlords. They put the least amount of money into maintenance. And the result of it is, terrible experience that tenants have, but also a long-term decay in the housing stock that we currently have. So we're in California definitely experiencing a shortage in new housing development, but it's also problematic if the housing stock we have now falls into disrepair because it's largely being held under these corporations. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Jyotswaroop. I think what you were just sharing about, these new landlords needing to, I guess you could say, optimize their business management practices for profit, rang true in the research that we did for our tech bias in housing work as well. One of our findings through that research was that once corporate landlords were through the door, there was this explosion of tech-backed management tools, you might call it landlord tech, to help them, manage massive portfolios profitably. It did that in part by automating and thus taking a lot of the downtime out of typical landlord processes. And I think one aspect of automation that has drawn the attention of the tenant community is algorithmic tenant screening. Of course, tenant screening is how landlords assess which applicants to rent open units to. Even under sort of its predecessor, analog screening, it's incredibly hard for people with adverse credit, criminal, eviction histories to access housing. And automation really has the potential to make that even more difficult when it's hidden behind black box algorithms. And I think, Katie, that speaks to some of the work that you're doing at Urban Institute. I know that you're looking into tenant screening and how landlords are making these decisions. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about your work and how you think this newer class of algorithmic predictive tenant screening could be impacting renters.
Sure. And, I can start by highlighting the challenges that I think a lot of researchers are facing as they try to understand both landlord decision-making and the screening processes, and then dive into what we know and where some research may be headed. But I think the first thing to note is just that it's incredibly difficult to measure landlord behavior, given how diffuse and decentralized landlords are. And this is especially true for some of those smaller mom and pop landlords, which own about half of all rental units, and about 3/4 of all the small units, about 1 to 4 units within a building. But this also extends to some of the larger property management and landlord companies as well that were mentioned in the last answer. And while many states and localities are trying to require landlords to be more transparent in their decision-making, for example, being willing to share rubrics on how they make decisions, very few landlords are willing to share these decision-making tools broadly. So while past research has indicated that landlords use a lot of subjectivity and things like gut feelings when they make rental decisions, the subjectivity makes it really difficult to identify or to witness structural or systemic decision-making processes because the process of leasing is just so difficult. And then, as you've mentioned before, and as TechEquity has written about, the number of tenant screening companies has just skyrocketed as technology has increased. And so we really don't know how each company is gathering, storing, managing, presenting their data, which makes it really difficult to systematically monitor data accuracy, data presentation, and then to understand how landlords are engaging. So with that background, I can talk a little bit about what we know and, I think where Urban's research, but also hopefully other researchers are headed. So given all of that, we know that tenant screening companies vary in how they treat and display data, with companies increasingly relying on those algorithmically generated risk scores and recommendations. So some companies just provide basic information such as criminal history or eviction filings, but others are using that data in sort of a black box fashion to generate risk scores that obscure the underlying data and provide very little insight into why an individual is being scored one way or another. A Consumer Reports study looked at sample reports and found that 8 of the 8 companies that they were looking at offered an algorithmically generated score, something like a green thumbs up or a red thumbs down, but didn't necessarily provide any information on sort of what was informing that decision or what was going into that. We also know that an overwhelming number of landlords appear to use these background screening checks. So about 9 out of 10 landlords use some type of screening report. And they often require that tenants pay for those. I think almost all of them require that tenants pay for the reports. But we also know that landlords don't necessarily understand the data that they're looking at. And so they're relying on a lot of these algorithmically generated reports to make decisions. So in the small number of studies that we've seen, landlords often don't understand the difference between an eviction filing and an actual eviction completion. And we know that those two things are very different. Landlords also often don't understand the difference between something like an arrest and a conviction, and often haven't thought very much about what the look back period might be. So for example, if somebody has an eviction filing on their record, but it was 8 years ago, should that still be included? And so many of them are thinking about like using these generated scores. And so the totality of what we know is that screening reports, and in particular the automated risk scores, create additional barriers to finding stable housing. So we see through qualitative evidence that a number of individuals find themselves being repeatedly denied housing, regardless of the accuracy of the report. And one study in Minneapolis found that an eviction filing limited housing choices for tenants. So about 94% of the people that they interviewed said that their residence was not their first housing choice because they just weren't able to gain access to anything because of what they saw. But we also know that regulation doesn't necessarily improve outcomes. So in a few of the qualitative studies, we've seen that some landlords appear to respond to regulations or restrictions on data usage by raising their standards for renting, so including raising rents or requiring higher credit scores, things like that. And so given all of this, we at Urban and I think other researchers are trying to understand how those black box algorithms interact with landlords and how landlords respond to information. And so one thing that we need to balance is how automated risk scores compare to that subjective gut feeling decision-making that landlords have often used in the past. And so we want to make sure that we balance the overall impacts of what is coming out of these algorithmically generated scores to some of those like subjective practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. I know through our research at TechEquity, the risk scores and just, the degree to which they are a black box was one of our, I guess, threads to keep pulling on coming out of our research. So we're also trying to wrap our arms around that and understand, again, from the tenant impact, how those algorithms are hitting landlords and thus, of course, affecting tenants as well. But I also think, as concerning as these risks and these potentials might be, one of the other findings from our research was that the involvement of businesses and corporate entities in the housing stock really doesn't begin and end with owning homes themselves. Companies are finding newer ways to profit off of the home sale transactions and the leasing processes themselves, as we've just talked about with these emergent tenant screening companies. But one of the ways that this is really showing up in the homeownership space that stood out to us at TechEquity is a model known as rent to own, or RTO. And Ainsley, I know that that's a model and a sector that you've researched and reported on extensively. This past fall, you did a really amazing deep dive into the sector, into one of the companies, Divvy Homes. And I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about what drew you to investigate rent to own and what you found in the course of your reporting.
Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting. I think, some stories obviously start with a tip, for example, from a source or something like that. And others start, when you are looking at a landscape and sort of seeing a trend and it raises questions. And this was definitely the latter. I think we were seeing, as everyone in America who needs housing is seeing, that, that it's incredibly hard to buy a house in the US today. It's incredibly hard to, find an affordable place to rent. And this idea that the American dream and that part of it was sort of dying to some extent, I think was really interesting to me. And then at the same time, to see all of these Proptech startups sort of promise to solve that problem for you through sort of various shortcuts or kind of band-aids, I think was really interesting. And so, where we started with this was essentially taking a look across a variety of those solutions and sort of trying to wrap our arms around like whether, how we felt about these different models, I guess. So, there are models like shared equity, where a company is sort of like buying into a house with you in some way. There are models where, the sort of power buying models where someone's helping you kind of manufacture a cash offer so that you can be more competitive. And then, of course, there's rent to own. And so, we started actually, looking at sort of all of these and trying to kind of understand, what to think about them. And I think, one thing that we learned early on is with things like shared equity, a lot of folks said, there's a way you can do this right. Like it's not necessarily a predatory model, like anything can become predatory essentially when there's a financial component, but people were definitely like less concerned about some of these models and more concerned about others. And rent to own just kept coming up consistently as a model that people had deep reservations about. And in some cases, that was simply the history. A lot of people, certainly at TechEquity and probably on this call as well, are somewhat familiar with some of the predatory history in rent to own, particularly like in Chicago, where I am. There's a really ugly and awful history of rent to own type contracts being used to exploit Black families on the south side of Chicago, and an enormous amount of wealth that those families would have otherwise been able to claim for themselves through housing, through ownership, was taken from them essentially. So I think people, feel uncomfortable often with the model because of that history. But obviously that's not enough to feel that, it could be that these new models are, have figured out something new. So I think that was sort of our approach going in is, let's take a look. Like, we don't know, like maybe the tech has improved on this model in ways that actually makes it a good option for people. But I think we found, very quickly as we started to dive in that was not necessarily the case. And that if, as we started to look at both the data and court filings and social media posts and talking to legal advocates, it quickly started to feel like even when the companies in the rent to own space, when the tech startups wanted to make good on promises around helping people become homeowners, it's not that it's hard to outrun the history so much, it's very hard to outrun the model. The actual just like profit model of rent to own, the way the economics work, it's very hard, even if you have good intentions, to really do right by people. And that's sort of how we ended up looking at Divvy. Divvy is one of the largest rent to own startups in this space, and also had one of the largest footprints in terms of court cases, very angry social media posts, and many other things. And that was sort of how we ended up talking to many, many Divvy customers. And also talking to the company itself, doing our own research in terms of scraping some data to kind of better understand their pricing. And of course, talking to other experts and folks in this space, competitors as well, to kind of wrap our arms around this company and how it was affecting people's lives, essentially.
Yeah, thank you. That just, makes me think of sort of the commonalities across what we're talking about here. You were mentioning, of course, trying to stack it against this historic model. And I think in part, one of the reasons why all of the ways in which Proptech and tech in general has embedded itself into the housing system is by positioning itself as fundamentally different than its predecessors, whatever that predecessor might be, right? For rent to own, it's, contracts for deeds that took place in the 40s and 50s, Chicago, but also everywhere. That sort of example is very prevalent in the history. For corporate landlords during the REO program, they were really touting themselves as being able to like professionalize the landlord industry and bring a degree of, professionalism that maybe mom and pop landlords weren't able to. Algorithmic tenant screening, they're saying that they can offer a degree of like data-backed certainty to landlords that their other assessments may be lacked. So I'm curious, and this is a question for everyone to jump in on, and Ainsley, if there's anything you wanted to add from your last response, how you see these models and sort of Proptech as comparing to its predecessors. Are they improvements on the older models, or are they, as Ainsley was saying, fairly, pretty much rebranded practices from the past? Maybe I'll start with either Jyotswaroop or Katie, since Ainsley just went.
Well, the first thing that comes up for me is, even as we're trying to understand who is employing Proptech, or, Katie, when you talk about the behavior of large landlords and mom and pop landlords, at least amongst in our community in California, there's a big question about who are these landlords, and are they really larger operation purporting to be smaller mom and pops? What we have is a proven track record of bad actors deliberately hiding their assets in a web of shell LLCs. So like, for example, 123 AB Street building is owned by 123 LLC. And nowhere in their filings, excuse me, can you see, what other LLCs they own and what is held in those LLCs? So sometimes it looks like we're looking at a behavior of a small operation, except it's only through the work of tenant organizers that we can like connect the dots and say, oh, actually this, behavior is also happening in this other building. And we know from then the lawyers who are helping the tenants that similar stuff is happening and similar paperwork was turned in. So I'm also curious if, you're grappling with like, who is it that you're actually dealing with? Sorry, Hannah, I feel like I added a question to your question, but that's what came up for me.
No, that's great. Yeah, we lost you for a second in a glitch, so that was what my face was responding to, but that was great context to add. Maybe I'll pivot to you, Katie, in your research on tenant screening. Is there a fundamental difference between predictive and what we'll call analog screening, for better or worse? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question, because I think one of the challenges that we're dealing with all data science and algorithmic processes and AI generally is that when you're using data that is biased or is like rooted in racist practices, such as, criminal history, we know that policing is racist, that it is much more likely for a Black or brown person, especially a man, to be represented in that system. So if what we're doing is pulling together that data and then saying, oh, well, we're improving this by creating some transparent processes, you're in a lot of ways reproducing just the challenges of the systems of the past. And so while I think there are some potential improvements by encouraging transparency of standards that are setting, we're really quite actively reproducing a lot of the problems that we had with other past issues. And we know that almost every type of data that is pulled into the screening process does have a disparate impact on Black and brown individuals. Eviction filings are significantly more likely to affect Black women, especially Black mothers, criminal history, and credit score data, all of which are sort of inequitable. So there could be some pushes for transparency there in terms of rubrics, but in general, I would say we're rebranding some of the practices of the past and building them into these systems.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, I think the thing that is so striking, particularly when you're dealing with prop tech, is just, yeah, there are so many complexities to how the real estate world works, you know, whether you're talking about, yeah, different sort of sub companies and organizations that have the ownership. We certainly saw that when we were looking through court records, you know, trying to figure out, you know, which homes were purchased by Divvy versus, you know, another sort of entity related to Divvy. But just from a consumer perspective, from a customer perspective, there's, you know, whatever complexity exists that existed in contract for deed, like still exists, right? Because the complexity then was that like maybe you didn't even have a contract, or maybe you didn't know how to read and write and you were, you know, signing something in some form. Today, like you're being sent a contract that is essentially an option agreement when you've never even had a mortgage before. You know, how you're not an options trader. You don't know what an option is. And here you are being asked to sign this very complex financial instrument. And without really a lot of guidance, and your guide, such as they are, is probably a real estate agent who is incentivized to close the deal as fast as possible. And so I think there's like a real like information mismatch that obviously the technology is not solving. The technology is solving the problem of how do you find a customer using social media ads? How do you bring them into some sort of onboarding system to process their application and check their credit? The technology is not solving the problem of like, how do you make this a transparent thing that they know that what they're buying in terms of the actual product. And so that was, you know, just something, you know, I saw again and again in talking with folks who are using these products. You know, certainly some people, you know, recognize that they had made a mistake in not even reading the contract before they signed it. But there were many other people who had tried their best to understand or thought they understood, and were still really blindsided by how these contracts work and what they had essentially the position they put themselves in. So I think, yeah, from my perspective, it was just really disappointing that we're not using the technology to sort of better support consumer decision-making.
Yeah, and I'm hearing this through line. As I said at the top of this conversation, you know, prop tech is vast. It covers all sorts of business models, all sorts of sectors, but I'm hearing a through line in this conversation around what's sounding like obfuscation, right? Whether it's through complexity or whether it's through the information asymmetries. And so not to tip the scales too much, but last week, TechEquity released an ethical practice guide for good faith companies to adopt in order to, you know, ensure that these tools and services are actually furthering housing justice and housing access. And I'm curious what advice or asks you all might have of prop tech companies that are genuinely trying to make the housing system a better one. What information do you think that they should make available, or what practices should they have in place in order to do that? And that's an open question again for anyone on the different pieces of the puzzle.
I'm happy to start us out. So on the tenant screening side, I think one of the challenges of current tenant screening is that so much of the information that goes into the screening is negative. So eviction filings, a criminal history, credit score dings. We have very little positive information. And in some ways, it's ironic that the one piece of information that right now is not included in many tenant screening reports is rent reporting. And so including more positive indications that are more directly linked to a tenant's actual ability to sort of, you know, uphold the lease terms, including more information like that, I think is critical. And Fannie and Freddie are doing some work right now to encourage rent reporting as a component of a credit score. But to ask about rent reporting in sort of a positive way, I think is one thing that would be really important for companies trying to work in good faith to incorporate. And beyond that, I mean, I think I will sound like a broken record, but I just think transparency in decision-making processes is really critical. So especially for large organizations that have a number of units available, doing things like posting criteria to websites that clearly communicate to tenants what they are willing to accept and not accept is also just a key first step to ensuring that people are not spending money on background reports when they will just be denied out of pocket, given a company's screening criteria.
Thanks, Katie. I don't know, Jyotswaroop and Ainsley, don't feel like you.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the rate with respect to rent to own, just understanding how many people are buying the house at the end of their contract, right? And that's not currently something that, people are required to do. And I think the other piece of that is that because there isn't regulation right now around sharing those numbers, I think it's very easy to sort of doctor them essentially. Like you might not separate out your cohorts, right? Like so given that people are entering these contracts at lots of different, over time, like understanding like of that first cohort, how many people bought back their home of that second cohort. So you can really understand like what's happening, I think would be incredibly useful information. Because I think the other piece of this is also that where I think the data gets sort of complicated is, yes, that it would be great to have that. I would love to have that. I think consumers should have that information. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that like some of these companies have slightly different strategies. For example, there's a company called Landis that I think their home buy rate is over 80%. But that's partly essentially because the whole model is to take people who are this close to being ready to buy in a home and getting them over the finish line. So that's fundamentally different from, a Divvy approach where I think their minimum credit score is 550 and you can have an income as low as $30,000 a year and they'll still potentially work with you. So, I think there's I would love to see more reporting on sort of customer outcomes, but at the same time, I think understanding that, there are sort of different flavors of these businesses and it is a little bit comparing apples and oranges at the same time. So, I guess, yeah, that's where hopefully some context setting and, there may be some other things we can do to sort of help people understand what are the right options for them to be thinking about.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Ainsley. And for us, the approaches or our focus is more on access to capital for these businesses, banks, and their investors. So I think one of the things that we've pushed for example, in the multifamily home lending, is that banks and investors really look at what the company is promising. So if they're saying that currently the building is earning, let's say, $30,000, but once they take it over, it's going to be earning $40,000, to actually pay attention, because that will inevitably mean mass eviction and rent hikes for people. So similarly, in Divvy's case and other tech firms, like there's a, call to action for investors to really look at, if you're interested in technology serving communities, to pay attention to how these technologies are actually, earning capital. Like, what is the product,
Yeah, I'm gonna sneak in one more question. We're about at the Q&A portion, but I'm always curious. I mean, doing this work, it can be really hard to find hope with, the state of the, expiring eviction moratoria and the wave of rent debt facing renters, homelessness rates, the fact that homeownership is just, I don't know, to call it out of reach feels trite at this point, right? Like, it's just our housing system is so fundamentally flawed for the majority of people, and doing the work that we all do, it can feel really daunting day in and day out. So I want to ask the question, what is something that each of you is working on that's making you excited about for our potential for a just housing future?
I can take this one. Yeah, one thing that I found exciting was some of the investors I spoke with who are focused on real estate as opposed to some of the sort of more general VCs. We're saying we're not going to invest in rent to own. Why would we back those companies? I want to back companies that are, for example, making it faster and cheaper to build new housing. Or, like, I think there were just some really innovative ideas that I heard, from folks who are investors who are actually the closest to this, as opposed to folks who maybe, aren't as specialized in real estate. So that was really encouraging, just thinking that, obviously these are like, everything is always so early in VC. It's like hard to know like how everything will play out, but just to know that some of the people who I found the smartest about this space were thinking about things where I felt like the solution, if it worked, would really get to the heart of the problem with housing and not just be another one of these sort of Band-Aid solutions. I wish them the best of luck.
I think I would say as the challenges are becoming, as they're increasing and as the challenges with Proptech are becoming more widespread and more well-known, I'm happy that they're spotlighting some of the problems that have existed for decades for both renters and potential homeowners, and that the increased attention is, I think, encouraging some states and localities to act in ways that are protecting renters and potential homeowners. So for example, California has limited access to eviction filings until the outcome of the eviction filing itself. And so I am excited to see that some states and localities are starting to pass some innovative legislation that is going to work to hopefully protect individuals from some of this harmful and challenging data that's just been out in the world for the last few decades.
Yeah, and I think for me, there has been movement forward in supporting first-time homebuyers, particularly BIPOC homebuyers. I'm a generation where I've had like 10 years of suppressed wages, first the Great Recession, then the pandemic. So I know a lot of people who, home buying is like a pipe dream. But I think we do have state legislation that is supporting community ownership and tenant right to purchase properties when they come up for sale. We have a bill that passed a couple of years ago in the midst of the pandemic that gives tenants and communities that right in foreclosed properties. And I think community land trusts are doing a really awesome job in putting out cooperative models. So I hope that they get, more funding and really proliferate. It's a good thing.
Yeah, you and me both. Well, thank you. I'm always surprised how quickly our time goes by, but we are now at the Q&A portion. So I wanted to call on my colleague Marion to come back on and maybe tell us what's going on in the Q&A panel.
Oh, I always forget to take my little camera thing off. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you all so much for this conversation. I feel like I learned a lot and appreciate all your expertise in sharing it today. And thank you to this lively chat. It's been really fun to watch everyone talk in there. Cool. I wanted to speak to something that I think, Ainsley, you kind of hinted at in your last response. Someone in the audience asked how much of this is technology versus a fundamental lack of housing supply, which this person says was exacerbated by the free money given out during COVID, making it easier for companies and high net worth people, individuals and organizations to buy more houses. So yeah, tech versus just like housing crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of the problem, right? Is this mismatch where it's like there's a housing crisis that tech will not solve. And so, but you're trying to create these, financial solutions for what's fundamentally a like physical space problem, right? And it just, that's, sort of a recipe for disaster, I feel like, in a lot of ways. And so, finding a way to like get to the core of the problem, feels like the best long-term solution. And a lot of these other things start to feel like, oh, well, maybe they would be successful in the short term, but like they're not going to solve the problem. And in cases of things like sort of like power buying, like these sort of like cash offer things, like sort of exacerbate it. yeah, I mean, those companies have really struggled. So I guess the one like note on that is that, the market does correct to some extent, right? So, as housing prices have markets have gotten less competitive over the last year or so, like those companies that you could have argued were sort of overheating things even more have really struggled and have had layoffs and that sort of thing. So so there is at least some feedback mechanism there. But yeah, I think the question like definitely gets at this point of like there's this fundamental sort of mismatch.
I think that's true on the screening side. I think housing supply certainly exacerbates issues that we see in terms of discriminatory like leasing and renting. Of the very limited studies we have, we know that in hotter markets, landlords are able to use more discretion and sort of take some of these like algorithmically generated decisions more at heart. When there's 15 people to 500 people vying for a single unit, you can definitely make more decisions. But I mean, the housing supply issue has also been one that's decades in the making. I think it might have been heated a little bit by COVID and the pandemic, but it certainly was not created during the pandemic. We know that a number of these companies have also been increasing their buying and purchasing, and much of that existed pre-COVID. So I think it's a combination. I think that technology can exacerbate a lot of these sort of disparate impacts we see, but this housing supply crisis, I mean, is sort of at the root of a number of these issues.
Yeah, and there's another question that I feel like maybe connects this a little bit is like, have we seen any impact that these prop tech companies have had on rents for better or for worse? And if we have been able to see that, how are we measuring that?
I tried to figure this out, if it's any help. Yeah, I think I actually reached out to you guys to see if someone had done this research. I was really curious whether we were seeing that, if there were places where prop tech buying, so I can't speak to the like larger corporations like buying up rental properties. That's like a separate piece. But we're talking about like startups buying properties. I looked into it. I was very curious whether there were any sort of specific zip codes where people have been really active, where maybe you could see this. And I guess the sort of good news is that, well, one, it's hard to find that data at this point, but two, the companies for the most part are still small enough that it's very hard to see any effects. Also, COVID did really sort of mess up the data. So it's also very hard to see effects for that reason. But I guess, yeah, for people who are concerned about this and the role of prop tech companies in buying properties, I would say, the time to act is now, if that is something you're concerned about, because while they can seem, influential, raising millions and millions of dollars as a prop tech company is very different when you're having to go up and buy homes for several $100,000. Like your reach is just not that great versus a company developing, a cute app. So while they do seem, I think, influential in some ways, they are, relatively speaking, pretty small, but yeah, that's not the corporate rental landlords that you see like the Invitation Homes. I'm talking specifically about the kind of VC-backed startups in this space.
Yeah, I think it gets to a question of who specifically are you talking about. I know that there have been some studies out there who are looking at the impact of institutional investors, specifically in the single family rental market and the impact on rents locally. And it's just a challenge of who are you talking about? Are you talking about the mega investors? Or are you talking about just investors that own 15 or more properties, which is generally how people sort of identify these organizations? Are you talking about people that are buying to hold the property? Or are you talking about people who are buying to flip? And there just isn't a ton of data, in part because of these definitional questions and because the data is really difficult to use. So I think some people have been able to look at, like the Atlanta Metro by itself, and using things like tax records are able to figure out who actually owns these properties and do some definitional things. But, doing a national scan of how any larger buyer is affecting rents is just really difficult because of all of these sort of methodological considerations.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very big question to ask. So appreciate you attempting to answer. I have a question here. Speaking to, the the kind of daunting nature of all of this tech being woven into the process of trying to either rent or buy a home. So like as a renter, how could I protect myself from unfair tech practices maybe being used against me when I'm looking for a home, if at all?
This is such a downer answer. I actually don't know, in part because, just given our sort of legal framework, it's really difficult to prove any sort of like discriminatory intent. And I don't know necessarily if we have enough evidence that somebody was sort of like discriminated against or harmed because of these tech practices. I would love to learn more from any of the other panelists, but from what I've seen, it would be really difficult to, protect yourself against a lot of these practices.
One thing you can do is if you're ever taken to court for an eviction, don't basically don't listen to anyone who tells you like if you settle, the eviction will not go on your record. To the point around sort of the California rules changing around this. I think people are often kind of told like on the side by a landlord's legal team that if you just, agree to this sort of settlement, this will not end up on your permanent record. And that tends to actually be not the case. You hear from a lot of folks in the legal aid world about their problems with this. It basically will happen sort of before they are involved. And so I think that would be the one thing you can do to protect yourself if you do end up in an eviction situation is understanding that, that you should not trust those promises, essentially.
Yeah, to add, definitely get a lawyer and advocate for right to counsel, because that at least gives you some representation.
Yeah, I was going to say just that. I think at least in some of the major renter hubs, if you will, do have right to counsel programs. Those programs are oversubscribed, so it doesn't make it terribly easy to have access. But I think as a renter, if you're interested in, some certain technology that may make home buying easier, there are also other nonprofit organizations, mission oriented entities who educate consumers. And the other thing to note is any government entity that is doing consumer protections is your friend. They have helplines and places to call. So really, you have to really be a smart advocate for yourself this time of day.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the question around data and being able to track any of this, what type of data would you want to have from prop tech companies that would be most helpful to answer some of these larger research questions?
All the data, it would be really, I think it would be great to have a partnership with a company that would help sort of demystify some of the data collection, data cleaning, and data processing questions. So, on the sort of tenant screening side, that would be really helpful. But I also think just clarity around things like for, rent to own, what is the actual data around the number of people who are entering as renters and then purchasing. So, I think it's difficult because there's so little data right now. So many of these companies are private. And so we just don't have a ton of information. So really information on screening, on purchasing, and on like tenant management processes would all be very helpful.
Yeah, and for us, we're really interested in watching the market consolidation. Unfortunately, all the antitrust rules at the federal level, they have a carve out for real estate. So for commercial property and rental property could all be owned by two large companies, and it would technically be okay. And we want to fight back against that. So I think one of the priorities in terms of information for our members really is understanding like who owns what currently, and then what are the other ventures are they invested in, really get the big picture of how these companies, what role these companies or players are engaging in.
And you segued me right into my next question. So thank you. What kind of regulations or protections do you think would be most helpful for your work to try to ensure that people can get equitable and stable housing, and to also better understand what's happening in the space?
Go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, on the tenant screening side, we just need a lot more regulation around the data, what data is allowed to be used, how data is handled and managed, how it's cleaned. Right now, we just know that the data is of such poor quality that it creates highly unreliable reports that have huge impacts on people. And so, I know the CFPB is working a little bit on this, but just having clearer standards around what the data is, what can be used for screening, and how clean or accurate it needs to be, I think would be very helpful.
And I think for us, all our members that are tenants' rights oriented, fair housing oriented, or home ownership oriented are really hurting for ownership information, beneficial ownership information at the federal level. There's some, effort to try and get at money laundering that's happening through real estate. But at the state level, we're interested in just understanding the consolidation in the market, and then, who and any overlap that we are seeing in, for example, Proptech companies and owners.
I might add to this too, just general tenant protections. So just cause evictions, making sure that evictions can only be filed in certain cases when the tenant is actually at fault, encouraging things like right to counsel, encouraging fair leases that are understandable from the tenant. So just like a whole range of tenant protections that we really don't have in place in a lot of places. So both data and then tenant protections.
Yeah, I think just I think people think about rent to own maybe right now in this context as being like very startup specific and companies like Divvy, but there are sort of unusual home ownership practices like this are way more common. I think it was Pew that did some research around this. And so I think, it is crazy to me that we still have not sort of defined even just sort of what these things are and how we should think about them. The fact that there's such a I
think we might have lost Ainsley. Devastating. I wanted to hear what she had to say.
I was thinking we might get her back, but it looks like perhaps not, although unfortunately that might be good timing. We are just about at time. Ainsley, sorry to see you go, but Jyotswaroop and Katie, thank you both so much for being in this conversation. If you enjoyed the conversation, please check out California Reinvestment Coalition, Urban Institute, and more of Ainsley's reporting for Fast Company, as well as TechEquity's Tech Bias and Housing reporting, and the ethical standard that we've released. And if you enjoyed that, please consider becoming a member today. But with that, we will give you 30 seconds of this time back. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you for having us. Bye.